whom perhaps looks similarly. There is a lot of work I have to do. When I'm watching a television, the only thing is they put on a beautiful actress and that's the end of the story. No work at all. Totally passive. So the challenge and the need to work with the brain is the key. We have learned this now from many, many different sources, that the brain must be challenged at all times. And one of the main reasons for this is that our brains are very good in not working, in finding some ways to avoid hard effort. Or to put it bluntly, the brain is basically a very lazy organ. The main reason behind this is that the brain is very smart and it finds ways to avoid the effort. If there are two ways that I can deal with a problem, and one of which is to think about it, to analyze it, to look at the alternatives, to compare them and so on, and the other is to bring up in my memory a similar problem from the past, the brain would always prefer the latter. So, okay, it's like this, so I will do the same, or I will think the same, because it's so similar to something else that happened to me before. And that precludes the need to think afresh about the problem, which is basically the difficulty with having too much experience. Now we can spend here our hour together talking about the importance of experience, and nobody in his right mind will argue against experience. But there is a flip side to this. And that is that if you have a lot of experience, you have seen everything, you have heard everything, you have thought everything, there is no need to think. And one of the reasons that some old people, and we are all in one form or another in this group, I'm long enough already in this group, have some decline we have some decline in our mental skills is because we are too experienced. Because experience goes up with age. So what is needed is new experience. That we cannot just rely on the old stuff that is already stored in our brains, but we need to look at it with fresh eyes. But it's very difficult to find new experience for people who are rather old. There is also I would say the inclination that as we grow older, we have to prefer the comfort of the familiar rather than seeking the new all the time. It's natural. So this is the crux of the matter. The problem is how to challenge the brain to engage in new stimuli, in new experiences. Before trying to answer some of the implications of this problem, I want to share with you some of the fascinating discoveries that actually demonstrate the mechanisms that the brain uses, which all support this notion that challenge is the key. And I will mention very briefly 4 of them, and they are all very, very interesting. The first is blood supply and oxygen supply. We know today that those cells of the brain that are active get more oxygen, better blood supply. And I'm sure we all know how important oxygen is for neurons in the brain. If, God forbid, they are deprived for some time of oxygen, they die very quickly. They thrive on oxygen. They need fresh oxygen all the time. And now we know how to get it. Use it. Use the cells and they will grab the oxygen. They compete with each other. Those that are not being used don't get the oxygen. I mean, the brain is smart enough to supply the blood where it's needed, not where it's not needed. So this is the first mechanism. We now have the brain imaging techniques that you can actually see the areas of the brain that get the supply of the oxygen. And when a person thinks about a problem, then you can see it, that it goes there. If he's doing something else, it goes there. Very important. So that in itself would be sufficient reason to convince people, okay, use as many of your cells as you can as often, so that they will get all the supply that they need. There is another mechanism, at least as interesting. And that mechanism deals with what happens when there is new information. Whenever we hear new information, and for instance, I hope that for you, some of what I'm telling you is new, the only way your brains can deal with it is by making new connections between different cells. Connections that were not there before the lecture. That is the only meaning of processing information in the brain, is establishing connections between different cells. So as we get more challenge, these cells become more and more interconnected. Just to give you a clue, a healthy neuron, a single cell, can have up to 30,000 ties with others. 30,000. Crazy number. And there are billions of cells. So it's a huge network. Now, why is being well connected important in the brain? For a very simple reason. We have many, many cells, billions of them, but after the age of 14, 15, we start losing thousands every day. We still have enough. I mean, that's not our problem. But the problem is, we never knew until quite recently, how is the decision made which cell would live and which cell would die? Just think about the problem. Let's say I'm a student, a young student, preparing for an important exam in college. And the night before the exam, I master the material. It is all stored here. And among the thousands of cells that I lose that night are those cells where I had that information. I'm lost next day. Impossible. It cannot happen. I mean, we do forget, but for other reasons, not because of that. It cannot happen for a simple reason. The brain makes a very simple decision. only cells that are lonely and unconnected can die. Cells that are well connected are protected from dying. Now, if you think about it, it makes a lot of reason, lots of sense. Because if they are alone, it means I haven't used them anyway. Because using them means making connections. So if they are lonely, that means it was sitting there since I was born or since I was the age of 2, never used this cell ever, so I wouldn't know the difference if I lose it. Totally unimportant to me. But those cells that I have been active with, namely I have been challenging them, working with them, and so on, they are well connected, they must stay. So the selection of who shall live and who shall die is according to a simple criterion. How well connected the cell is. If it's connected, protect it. It's needed. Makes a lot of sense. So this is a good second reason, in biological terms, why it is useful to process new information and protect ourselves from dying. The third mechanism relates to the correction of mistakes that can happen in the processing of the cell. You know, a single neuron in the brain is very small, but the mechanism of its functioning is extremely complex. And think about a car that has been running for 70 years already. You know, some things get wrong sometimes. Happens to the best of cars. And these neurons are as old as we are. Most of them. Almost all of them. As old as we are. The only cells in our body which are as long as we are. I mean, if I look at my hand, for instance, the skin, it's on the average 3 weeks old. It's changing all the time. Which raises another interesting question. Why does a hand, which is made only of new cells, look old? But there is no shortage of mysteries that still wait for answer. But the material that composes my hand is new. With the exception of my brain. So if we have all these old cells working for years and years and years, sometimes there is malfunctioning, sometimes there are problems. And fortunately, there is a mechanism that evolved during evolution that helps the brain to correct the mistakes of its own cells. It's like sending the cell to a garage. This is a substance which is secreted by the cell itself. The cell itself produces a substance. It's called nerve growth factor, doesn't matter. And this factor actually works as a diagnostician and as a mechanic that helps to correct whatever is wrong in the complex machinery of the cell itself. Now the beauty again is that the more the cell is active, the more it produces this substance. So it, again, better protected. That was the fourth one, is the most dramatic.